Wow, things are crazy out there. Wish you were in another country? Who doesn't? You know what can help the internet think you are? NordVPN! Guys, you're watching a web video in 2025. You know what a VPN does. And if you don't, you can learn more and try the NordVPN 2-year plan plus 4 months extra by going to nordvpn.com/moviebob or follow the link in the description. Risk-free with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee. VPNs help you, your PC, your workstation, your tablet, your whatever. I'm an old guy, we just called it the computer. Be in more than one place at one time, even if you're not. Trying to look up the classic or hard to find movies, TV series, or games I talk about on my channel, NordVPN can help with that. In an age where more and more content is getting restricted, siloed, or censored, NordVPN is all about making the internet more free and letting you see and share more information. The way the web ought to be. Like I said, check it out for yourself and see what you might have been missing. Click the link in the description or go to nordvpn.com/moviebob to get the NordVPN 2-year plan plus 4 months extra risk-free with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee. And now, on to the show. Well, hey, so this has been a long time coming episode that's way too long in coming, and also probably way too long to the point that we've basically had to cut it in half and explain why on both counts. But just like I said in the last one, I don't throw stuff out I can still post that sorta still feels like it's something when I can still pull some kind of numbers. Sunk cost is not a fallacy when you've got my bills, gang. And while also I'd stop short of just assuming anything I have to contribute to a topic is important, the subject itself is important, and I don't just want to dismiss it, so it is what it is. Anyway, this part 1 and 2 started out as an attempt to, not to get overly self-serious about things, grapple with one of the older media history episodes that in hindsight I just felt like I missed the mark on. Specifically, the anniversary of the so-called Disco Demolition riots at Chicago's Comiskey Park and parallels being drawn in the present-day pop culture between animating events of that era and the so-called anti-woke backlash culture of the present day, that I'd been too quick to dismiss or paper over the notion of politics being downstream from culture rather than the other way around as conventional wisdom, and also that whatever my take had been, that there just hadn't been enough space in the original short subject format from when the show was on the other website to give full accounting of what was, after all, 40 years worth of music industry history, American history, pop culture overview, generational and demographic explanations, and just a lot of historical context period that had informed it. And going back and attempting to address all of that, or to do a better job at it anyway, especially in a more candid, partially unscripted, being real with the audience fashion as felt correct in the moment, which was months ago at this point, ended up in the first edit with an episode that's not only almost 50 minutes long, depressing as hell, and a lot of tangents, but also, yeah, unavoidably, when you're doing any history episode about almost any part of the entertainment industry in the late 70s, but especially this one, eventually you hit that spot in the timeline where you have to go, and then AIDS happens. And there's just no way to make that an act break on a show like this and not have it feel like you're doing a bad attempt at doc comedy. Or maybe there is, but I'm certainly not a talented enough person to pull it off. You can't drop that shit at the halfway mark and expect people to still hang out and laugh at your 80s memes and Simpsons clips in the remaining 20 to 25 minutes. It doesn't work, I fucking tried. So instead, I cut it in half. Spoiler warning for wear, I guess. So this will be a two-parter, and I'll probably put the two halves together for completion's sake after that as well. This is part 1, which is a lot of history. Hope you like it, even if a bunch of this stuff is kind of a bummer. Stay tuned for part 2 coming soon, which is also kind of a bummer, but I genuinely hope strikes people who need it to in a more hopeful way. And yeah, with this out of my system, finally, I gotta do something fun again in the near term, right? Anyway. So I recently reran an older episode about the Disco Demolition event from the mid-1970s. This is a semi-unscripted episode. You'll be seeing a lot of cuts here. I wanted to rerun that episode and also do a retake of this one because while I think the history in that episode holds up pretty well, I don't necessarily think that the take or grasp of history contextualizing it necessarily did in light of some other recent revisitations of the history of that era and moment, and as much as I pride myself as being somewhat ahead of my time or ahead of the curve on guessing meaningless movie bullshit that doesn't matter, in terms of, actual public events and sweep of history stuff that actually does matter and can make a difference, man, do I wish I was better at predicting how that was going to go, because I could probably do more good in the world. Kids, that's what they call a Cassandra complex. In any case, to rerun some clips from the episode just to bring everyone up to speed as to what that was about. The Great Cautionary Tales of Fandom Gone Wrong, or at least out of control. The short version is that on July 12, 1979, the promoters of a doubleheader baseball game between the Chicago White Sox and Detroit Tigers at Chicago's Comiskey Park had arranged a between-game event with Steve Dahl, the DJ of a popular local rock radio station, titled Disco Demolition, wherein a large box filled with disco albums donated for this purpose by attendees would come to be blown up with explosives by Dahl and his crew, who'd cultivated a comedy persona around the gimmick of being purist rock and roll fans at war with the disco trend in popular culture. Modern popular culture remembers the disco moment and its subsequent crack-up as a kind of weird fever dream, but the whole sweep of it was much more about a point where this specific music and dance genre came to be identified as the symbolic nexus point for a very rapid push into the cultural mainstream of aesthetic elements borrowed from gay and black urban metropolitan subcultures that crashed hard against a backlash supercharged by the confluence of the AIDS crisis and economic downturn and the rise of Reaganism in the moral majority. We mostly remember the disco sucks blowback now as a culture collectively getting tired of tacky clothes and the cheesy mainstream side of the disco genre because it's easier than accepting the ensuing decade's cultural complicity in the homophobia, racism, and bordering on genocidal, callous disregard of the HIV epidemic that were in reality inextricably bound to the general rightward tilt of late 70s, early 80s pop paradigm. Basically, once celebrities got big into the club scene, a streamlined, watered-down version of this musical experimentalism, generalized as disco, became a huge, mega-profitable fad as a way for the mainstream, read middle-class white people of America to nibble at the edges of the counterculture without feeling too kinky about it. A certain percentage of traditional rock radio stations and analog musicians felt financially stung by the trend and publicly lashed out about it, which got conflated with media perception of disco as a gay, liberal, foreign, black, Latin, etc. genre invading white spaces, and the general conservative backlash wave that was about to land in the 80s. At the actual event, even before Dahl got to blow up his box, it turned out too many fans had shown up and there were too many records. Depending on who you ask, this was in part because some had brought not only disco albums but also R&B, soul music by black and Latino artists in general, or rock albums by artists who'd express leftist politics, so people had started throwing them from the stands like frisbees during the first game. When the explosion actually went off during the changeover, it was larger than expected and waves of fans decided to rush the field and began trashing and looting the stadium, ultimately causing the second game to be forfeited as riot police had to be called into the stadium. The whole debacle made national news, international news really, characterized in Rolling Stone magazine as your paranoid fantasy about where the ethnic cleansing of rock radio could ultimately lead, and later compared to a Nazi book burning by legendary music producer and chic guitarist Nile Rodgers. To this day, the Disco Demolition riots and the ugly attitudes associated with it are often framed as a flashpoint that not only killed a music genre, but perhaps helped kickstart a hard-right backlash cultural domino effect that would effectively include the rise of the moral majority and Reaganism in America, a framing that continues to this day. When the White Sox this past year decided to mark the anniversary last month by selling cheeky commemorative t-shirts and having Steve Dahl throw out the first pitch, the event was met with public outrage in some quarters due to the organization not only making no mention of how the history had come to be viewed by some, but also hosting the commemoration early during Pride Month. Now, to be clear, that definitely feels like no small amount of insensitivity at play, but I myself have always been a bit skeptical of the idea that Disco Demolition itself was a catalyst without which the ensuing backlash culture of the early 80s would either have not happened at all or taken a significantly different form, to be a bit on the tenuous side. That isn't to say that rowdy, angry, overly invested in the wrong way fans of music or sports or comics or whatever aren't a bad thing or part of the problem or deserve some kind of absolution for their part in these matters, but sometimes I do think that because they're the most visible, easily contextualized, and reachable on the ground part of negative cultural waves, there's a temptation to make them the focus of the blame rather than the bigger, harder to grasp and therefore fight forces that actually drive these things. It's important to remember that the majority of fandom itself is a reactive, reflective thing. It responds to the world much more than it shapes it, so instead of looking back on things like Disco Demolition or any of our current embarrassments as the starting point of bad happenings to come, maybe it's better to try and see them as evidence of bad happenings that are already underway. Well, there's still time for us to recognize it and do something about it.
That was a mistake.
So I'm old enough to have really been born in the immediate aftermath of the disco craze as a cultural trend, having been immediately dead and buried at the moment that I was born, and then having grown up in the aftermath of, oh god, disco, no one ever liked that, and then reaching adulthood in the moment of, actually no, that wasn't so bad, and people actually liked it, that was a thing that you were gaslit about, and now having come through a couple different reappraisals of that.
Did you know that disco record sales were up 400% for the year ending 1976? If these trends continue, hey!
Some of you, I would imagine most of my audience at this point, my audience seems to, at least according to analytics, tends to trend about a decade or so younger than me, which is probably for the best. I would be really annoyed to think that I am only talking to people who are directly of my own cohort. Not that I don't appreciate people of my own cohort, but I don't like the idea of speaking only to an echo chamber or not having anything to say to either those of an older generation who I would admire or a younger generation that might be able to learn something or that I might be able to learn something from. I would hate to think that I'm even the good version of yet another middle-aged YouTuber only speaking to other middle-aged people on YouTube. Just the thought of doing that kind of grumpy talk radio bullshit. Just, yeah, no. Pass. But to digress, the disco moment in American culture, in popular culture, and we're speaking very much of American culture, so global audiences, forgive an American talking about Americans, but this is an American phenomenon, is what we sometimes call an inflection point of mainstream culture, where what had been an element of subculture and alternative culture saturate the undercurrent enough that they break through into mainstream culture, and mainstream culture begins trying them on aspects of subcultures. And you hit a point where either a certain amount of that becomes mainstream culture, or mainstream culture snaps back against it and says, oh, we actually dipped our toe in the pool and it turned out the water was hot, or we don't actually like this, etc., etc. And in American popular culture, the 1970s was essentially that for mainstream middle-class white culture, trying on the aspects of the counterculture, drug culture, the quote-unquote hippie-yippie culture, non-white culture, etc., that had prevailed throughout the 1960s as elements of the rising youth culture that had come into focus as the baby boomers supplanted the previous generation of their parents as the top market demographic in the economy.
I used to be with it, but then they changed what it was. Now what I'm with isn't it, and what's it seems weird and scary to me. It'll happen to you.
That's a lot of jargon all at once, but this is an unscripted thing. I'm not going to be putting up as many graphics or just moving pretty fast. There's a great movie called The Limey, where a character played by Peter Fonda, who's supposed to be this burned-out guy who's sold out, who was a cool guy in the 60s and is now a music executive, who's a villain-type character in the movie. He's describing someone asking him what the 60s are like, and it's very meta because it's Peter Fonda. And he explains that it was really only 1966 and a little bit of 67 for him.
It must have been a time, huh? A golden moment.
Have you ever dreamed about a place you never really recalled being to before? A place that maybe only exists in your imagination? Someplace far away, half remembered when you wake up. When you were there, though, you knew the language. You knew your way around. That was the 60s. No, it wasn't that either. It was just 66 and early 67. That's all it was.
And what he's talking about is the 1960s as people think of it, you know, this cool haze of great music and kids dancing in the mud and protests and the great moment when things seemed possible, that it was really only about a year and a half period. And that's probably true of the way actual generational moments really happen. When people talk about what were the 60s about, well, there was so much else happening in history. There was real protests, real things happening, real important stuff. But the t-shirt slogan, you know, sex, drugs, rock and roll, fight the power, all of that did carry on well beyond in a superficial, hey, these are fun things to do, well past that point, to the point where it curdles into just toys to play with. And there's a school of thought that says that the 1970s is by and large the point where the toys of the 60s cross over directly from the youth culture and the alternative culture into something that suburban American culture can play with. Because when we say mainstream culture in America, let's be very honest here, we're talking about middle-class white people. You know, for you younger folks, pop culture reference point, this is where That 70s Show, the sitcom, is basically about this. The point where all of the fun, dangerous, angry stuff of protests and drugs and people dying in Vietnam and dancing in the mud at Woodstock and, you know, drug overdose and whatnot, when all of that transitions away from that into kids in the Midwestern suburbs smoking dope in the basement. That's literally the 70s.
Okay, I thought about it. And I'm going to the disco. Just on the off chance that they might mix up a little rock and roll, man.
Yeah? Well, I have something to say. I went to the mall today, and I bought a pair of new shoes.
So outside the suburbs, in the urban white middle class, the metropolitan white middle class, you have the disco scene, where you have ostensibly straight white people dipping their toes into the discotheque culture to try it on for size. Hey, let's put on leisure suits and be a little kinky and go to gay minority clubs, or had previously been a little bit gay, mostly minority music dance clubs, and you see what that's like. Dance around to this, you know, heavy synth, backbeat music, disco music, the genre evolves now into house music and whatnot. The Bob and Carol, Ted and Alice moment of, hey, maybe mainstream suburban couples should swing, translated into music and dance culture. Take some elaborate drugs, loosen up, see what happens. And this becomes a trend, the music gets popular, and suddenly this is everywhere. Disco was a music trend, but also a fashion and culture trend, growing out of, but not totally even directly associated with disco as a music genre popular in minority, majority, and or gay and queer music clubs, which in turn became shorthand for the fashion and dance, dating, and lifestyle aesthetic connected to those clubs and that whole scene. Just in a way to describe a lifestyle aesthetic without saying it all at once.
Everybody disco dancing! Lots of fun, good time for all! I'm having very good time!
And suddenly, this is everywhere. It's on the radio, there's disco remixes of popular songs. There's a disco remix of the Star Wars theme. Disco versions of popular rock songs. Kiss, who made, you know, Disco Sucks their anthem after this, records a disco song, which is fucking hilarious. Disco Duck is a song. There's disco cartoons. It's a culture trend. Now this reaches a pop culture crescendo, as it often does, in a very dumb way, despite the movie not being bad, really. In a movie called Saturday Night Fever, which comes out in 1977, yes, same year as Star Wars, and it's weird that those two don't get, like, mentioned in the same context very often, even though they're similar, if disparate phenomenons. So Saturday Night Fever, which I imagine at this point most people really only know as a couple of scenes that are not even the whole movie of John Travolta dancing to pretty good music and John Travolta strutting down the street to the iconic song. Like, I don't know when is the last time that even people who think of this as a good movie have watched the whole movie, and most of you probably know of the movie but haven't watched it. If you're younger than even 35, have you watched all of Saturday Night Fever? You probably should. It's a decent movie. It's iconic. Do people know that this is fake? It's a good movie based on complete bullshit. What happened is a British rock journalist had basically gotten assigned to do a story about, hey, we've heard through the grapevine, because back then no Twitter, no social media, basically, you know, you would still get stories of, hey, a guy heard a thing, fly across the pond and look into this crazy story. Sounded like a good pop culture story, and it was a good pop culture story when you hear about it. The cool new thing for young, horny straight guys who want to get laid is not to hang out at the malt shop or the sock hop, as it was maybe 10 years ago, but to go to what were previously mostly black, mostly, maybe a little queer, dance clubs in the cities, dressed in leisure suits and slick hair and whatnot, and dance to what was even then recently mostly thought of as gay music isn't that unusual. These, working class, garage mechanic kids getting dressed up in leisure suits and dancing to disco music, and isn't that an interesting story that is now the cool thing? Wouldn't that be a funny story? Sure it is. So he goes to investigate this story and supposedly can't get into these clubs because they have bouncers and whatnot, and just says, oh no, hey, this is scary, and instead decides, yeah, but I'm still getting paid to do this, so he makes up a guy and writes a fictional-ass story about just a guy who is, again, can't stress this enough, a made-up fucking guy who is like the quintessential young, scrappy, working-class Italian guy who also loves disco music and dancing and wins competitions and whatnot. He figures, actually, this is bullshit. They're not going to run this. This is crap.
How do you know someone didn't just make it up?
What? You mean just lie? You really think someone would do that?
They run it. It becomes popular. He gets the screenplay rights, and this becomes a huge hit as the movie Saturday Night Fever, which of course is a hit because it's a pretty good movie. John Travolta's a big star, he can dance good, and the music is great, so huge hit. And we don't find out that he made all of this shit up until 20 years later. But in real time, back when it first comes out, huge hit. Disco fever literally takes over the world for a couple years, takes over at least US popular culture for a couple years, and right around this same time, mainstream culture kind of decides that it's had enough of the disco thing.
I don't want to play with you anymore.
Regardless of what else you think of it, this whole moment stops having a moment. Rock radio kind of decides, no, we're sick of running disco music. A lot of our audience changes the channel when they hear a rhythmic beat and synthetic strings in the background. We don't like running the covers of songs with disco tracks in them. People get on edge about it. There's not a lot of genre crossover here. And there is also, of course, a lot of homophobia, racism baked into it as well. Like, it becomes a thing where I hate all this gay stuff, I hate black music and slang and fashion being everywhere, I hate the party drug culture, I hate current thing, can all be couched as, I hate disco. And it's not even the music, just this nebulous concept of hating this cultural moment. And I want to stress that, too, that this did not mean that everyone who hated disco music, everyone who hated disco culture was hateful, but it became a really easy way for hateful, bigoted culture to smuggle itself in under the guise of something that was just hating a dumb pop culture trend. Does that sound familiar?
Princess Peach!
Yeah.
Giving her pants!
Yeah.
Total mainstream Hollywood girl boss voice.
Yeah.
Barbie is like the deformed, mutated rage child of Captain Marvel, Ghostbusters 2016, and She-Hulk.
Bo Peep from Toy Story 4, Ray Skywalker.
An assault on not just Ken, but all men.
Preachy, man-hating, and a zombie lie.
Current version of this, of course, is much more tiresome because it doesn't even need a genre to attach itself to. Like, there's no woke genre. Diversity is not a genre. So everything is more upfront about it. Someone who says, I hate wokeness, basically gives me, I don't like empathy. I hate forced diversity. Well, what the fuck is forced diversity? That's not a real thing. That's an imagined thing. Force of anything like that is in the eye of the beholder. So whenever someone says, I hate forced diversity, it means they perceive it as being forced. That's not to say that you have to like or dislike something, but like forced basically means this is diverse in a way that I do not like. And it feels very much of the same kind. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're like an outright super racist guy, but it means you should think about yourself. Maybe there was like a word beginning with a P that you should investigate or check of some sort. But that's what it's similar to.
We're not gonna make it, are we? People, I mean.
And in the 70s, this culminates, at least in moments. I don't think it's the only moment or the biggest one. You're calling it the night disco died was a little much. But as a thing you can point to, yeah, Disco Demolition was a moment to point to and say, yeah, that was probably a sign of bad stuff happening. Now, of course, the other X factor in all of this, which is so omnipresent it almost makes the rest of it unspoken, is in the midst of all this, coming right up behind all of it and then overwhelming all of it, is that you had the AIDS crisis happen. So you have not only did gay, urban, progressive culture dial itself back publicly, you had millions of people sick and dying as well, and that can't be minimized. Like, who knows what happens culturally to a moment in pop culture where the toe dipping in of mainstream middle-class white culture pulls back and says, oh, hey, you know, that version of maybe that's a little much for us was not immediately countered by literal plague. Who knows what else would have happened? Because that is a 1-2 knockout punch. And it almost feels, not even almost feels, it does feel grotesquely minimizing to even conflate or connect the two. Because it's not like, oh no, if only records hadn't been blown up somehow magically through karmic fate, this horrible disease epidemic would not have also risen alongside. This was a terrifying coincidence of events, and we'll just never know what might have been had the cultural forces that were pushed back against by the, oh, we don't like this in the form of disco moment, been able to regroup. Were they not doing triage and self-protection against a plague epidemic that the rest of culture was busy actively trying to ignore, if not exacerbate? Yeah, so you see what I mean? Trying to pivot back to history and then to laughs and find an ending over another 20 minutes after that would be exhausting, in my opinion. Doesn't work in this format. Maybe it did work for Nebula. I don't know. I'm not on Nebula. I don't even own a purple light bulb. And I think somebody still needs to invite you. That hasn't happened yet. I don't think. I should check my emails. Anyway, that's where the 70s pop music history part basically cuts off, and the upside of putting a cut there means it forced me to arrange most of the parallels to modern culture wars and solutions and don't give up parts into the second half, and for me, that was the more important stuff, much more so the reason to do this whole episode in the first place, honestly. Forced me to make that more cohesive, more streamlined, more in focus, so we'll pick that up in part 2. I think it ultimately comes together about as well as it was gonna. I hope you like it, or at least take something positively away from it. Coming soon. See you then.